Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on the National Service Criminal History Checks, or NSCHCs. My name is Brian Cognato, and I'm a Grants Management Specialist at CNCS, focusing just on these requirements. Today we'll be looking at them specifically as they apply to grantees of the Social Innovation Fund, also known as the SIF. We're going to look at some specific challenges that SIF grantees face. We're going to point out some best practices, and we'll share some insights with you from a prior Social Innovation Fund intermediary. Our goal will be to get you ready to meet your responsibilities for on-time, every-time compliance with the NSCHC requirements from day one. This video is intended to be step 2 in a longer learning pathway. If you haven't already viewed CNCS's introductory e-course on the NSCHC requirements, you may want to pause this video, view that e-course, and return to this at a later date. That e-course provides you with a complete overview of the NSCHC process and introduces some resources that can help you be on time every time. This webinar will also assume that you're familiar with some of the concepts introduced in that e-course, so be sure that you've completed it so that you can follow along. There's a link to the course at the end of this webinar if you want to take it now. Your learning won't end here either. Running NSCHCs on time, every time is a process, and it can be complicated at times. For that reason, we're asking that you put this knowledge to work right away and go out and run a complete National Service Criminal History check soon after completing this webinar. It can be on yourself or another person in your organization who requires a check. The NSCHC process can vary based on your state and your program model, so it's important to get concrete hands-on experience early. That will allow you to bring any questions to your program officer right away before it's too late to meet our on-time, every-time standard. You might be asking yourself why we're using such an intensive process to introduce you to these requirements. You might feel a little bit like this poor guy getting overwhelmed with all this terminology. But the fact is that this is something that our SIF intermediaries have told us is challenging time and time again. On the screen, you can see 2 excerpts from evaluations of the SIF done by outside experts, and both of them found that the National Service Criminal History Check requirements are a major hurdle for grantees. To be frank, other intermediaries have told us that this really does require a deep dive. In addition, as you likely learned in the e-course, these requirements are very important. This was covered in that course in more depth, so be sure to go back if you want more information. But the bottom line is that these requirements are a public safety issue. They're intended to protect those that we serve. There are other reasons why they're so important as well. We're all stewards of taxpayer dollars, and we take that responsibility very seriously here at CNCS, and we hope you do as well as a SIF grantee. In addition, they're based in the law, and they are time sensitive. There are certain things that you need to do before you can charge an hour of staff time to your Social Innovation Fund grant. Finally, there are concrete consequences for noncompliance. Cost disallowance, which is essentially sending some money back to CNCS, is the standard remedy for noncompliance with these requirements. We have had some SIF grantees have to go through that process before, and you want to make sure that you're equipped to avoid that process down the line. The purpose of this process is to make sure that at the end, you are not being overwhelmed by the criminal history check terminology. Instead, you're a criminal history check ninja, riding these terms and these concepts towards compliance, that you can have the impact that you want to have. To do that, we're going to review a few key items that have specific importance for SIF grantees. And we're going to start by taking a closer look at covered positions. On the screen right now, we have a quick summary of what it means to have a covered position, particularly in the world of the Social Innovation Fund. As you may remember from the e-course, generally, a covered position is any position receiving a salary, stipend, living allowance, or education award from a CNCS-funded grant. In the world of the Social Innovation Fund, we're really looking at salaries. We're looking at the people on your budgets that are receiving some funding, either from the Social Innovation Fund, from CNCS, or from match. Remember, it's both sides of the budget. These are the individuals that need to go through this process, what we call covered positions. Contractors and individuals who are just receiving some salary from your indirect cost rate are generally not covered, although we'll come back and talk about contractors shortly. This is an excerpt from an actual SIF intermediary budget. As you can see, we've got a mix of positions here, some funded largely by the CNCS share of the grant, some funded by match. You can tell that some people are charging all of their time to this grant, and others are only charging a percentage of their time to this grant. However, because all of these positions are receiving some funding from the CNCS funded grant, they are all covered. That means that all of the individuals filling these positions will need to go through the NSCHC process. It's a pretty simple test. It can get more complicated, though, when we begin to look at other parts of our SIF budgets, in particular, subgrants and contracts. As you should have learned in the e-course, the NSCHC requirements will flow through to all of your subgrants. That means that you're not only responsible for complying yourselves, but you're responsible for ensuring that your subgrantees comply with these requirements as well. They will need to do the same thing that we just did. Look at the budget, identify covered positions, and then make sure those individuals go through this process. And you will need to help them do that. As I already mentioned, these requirements generally do not apply to contractors or consultants, but there's a small nuance to this. If you look in the Code of Federal Regulations, you'll see that subrecipients or subgrantees, we use those terms interchangeably, and contractors have very specific definitions. Once again, subrecipients or subgrantees and contractors have very specific definitions. You'll also see this section, which is 2 CFR 200.330. Once again, that's 2 CFR 200.330, and you can look it up on your own after this webinar if you'd like. I just want to point out a few key items here. This section is telling us how we can determine the difference between a subrecipient or a subgrantee and a contractor. The first thing that I want to point out is it is your responsibility as an intermediary to classify each relationship you have with an organization that receives federal funding on a case-by-case basis. Again, you need to make that decision on a case-by-case basis for every organization that is receiving funds from your SIF grant. In addition, the substance of the relationship is more important than the form of the agreement. What that means is that it isn't what you call it that's important, it's what the agreement actually looks like. Just calling something a contract in terms of the Code of Federal Regulations does not mean it's a contract. Instead, you need to apply these factors and determine which category a given relationship falls into most appropriately. In addition, note that there are only 2 categories. There's nothing on here called partner or other arrangement. We just have a choice between subrecipients in A or contractors in B. That means that you'll need to make a decision about which category a given relationship best fits in, even if maybe it's not a perfect fit. This is important for the NSCHC requirements, but it's really important for all of your federal award management because all of your grant terms and conditions flow through to subgrants, and they don't flow through to contractors in the same way. We'll spend some time on this here, but if you're not clear on making these distinctions, be sure to talk to your grants officer who can help you. Let's start by looking at some examples. Mr. Darcy is a training provider contracted to help an intermediary coach its subgrants on fiscal compliance. He works for several other clients, has developed his own curriculum, and operates without close supervision of the intermediary. Let's apply the factors in the Code of Federal Regulations to Mr. Darcy. 1, he provides the goods and services within normal business operations. 2, he provides similar goods and services to many different purchasers. 3, he normally does this in a competitive environment. And 4, he provides goods and services that are ancillary to the federal program, in this case focusing on fiscal compliance. In this example, Mr. Darcy is a contractor, and that means he would not be subject to the NSCHC requirements. Let's look at another example. The same intermediary provides some funding to a local community partner to implement its key initiative, a job training program for marginalized youth. Mrs. Sherman provides these services. She uses a curriculum developed by the intermediary, and the youth that she serves are included in the intermediary's key performance metrics for this grant. Providing the service is exclusively her full-time job. As we can see, our test is going to have a different result here. We're looking at the factors for subrecipients. Mrs. Sherman has her performance measured in relation to the objectives of the federal program, and she uses the federal funds to carry out a program for a public purpose, as opposed to providing goods and services for the benefit of the pass-through entity. Regardless of whether the intermediary or the subgrantee calls this a contract, it's a subgrant for the purposes of the Code of Federal Regulations. The organization should classify it that way, and the NSCHC requirements would then apply to Mrs. Sherman and others like her who may be in covered positions. This would be true of all grant terms and conditions. Notice also that any given relationship doesn't have to check all the boxes for one category. It's a matter of determining which is the best fit. These were two pretty clear-cut examples, but you can imagine that sometimes it gets trickier. The key is to return to this test, classify the relationship appropriately from the beginning, justify your rationale in writing, and then proceed consistently. For the next major topic, we're going to talk about monitoring your subawards. There's a whole module on this in that required e-course, but it's worth reiterating some key points here. Remember that you are not only responsible for meeting these requirements yourself, but also for ensuring that your subawardees meet them. Just as CNCF is going to monitor you as an intermediary and help you achieve compliance, so too you have that responsibility to do the same with your subgrantees, who have the responsibility to comply. In addition, this is something that we've also heard can be challenging for our intermediaries. To quote one of our external experts who did this, actually quoting an intermediary, Eleanor Rutland, the Chief Operating Officer of Venture Philanthropy Partners, has said, "We've always been very serious in our monitoring of the organizations we work with, but the federal piece adds a different level of complexity and responsibility. To be frank, this is also a challenge that you should be aware of and begin preparing for from day one." So how can you help your subgrantees comply? A good starting point is providing lots of training and resources, like our e-course, this webinar, and other materials that you can find on the NSCHC Knowledge Network, like our video training library on the CHC requirements. We'll come back at the end of this webinar and point out some great resources that you can use to help your subgrantees. Many organizations also help their subgrantees stay in compliance by establishing extra safeguards. For example, you might remember that certain individuals can begin worker service even if all of their checks haven't been completed by the process that we call accompaniment. There are some individuals that can begin worker service even while their state or FBI checks are pending. But many organizations have actually decided that they will not allow that. They will have a standard that's stricter than our standard because they don't want their organizations using accompaniment because they feel that it's prone to non-compliance. You, as an intermediary, have the discretion to establish an extra safeguard like that if you feel like it will better allow you and your subgrantees to comply. Other intermediaries actually require their subgrantees to provide proof of compliance before they reimburse them. Remember, this is an on-time, every-time standard, and requiring that proof on the front end can make sure that nothing is happening late. Those are just two examples, and if you talk to your peers in the Social Innovation Fund intermediary community, they can share many more options. We've actually gone ahead and asked one of your peers to share some of their thoughts about working through this process. We asked them a few questions to try to help us understand what they wished they had known when they were at the same stage that you're at right now as a new Social Innovation Fund intermediary. First, we asked them what they wished they knew at the beginning of the process. We've edited their responses for clarity and for brevity here. Basically, what they said is that they wish they'd taken more time to establish NSCHC procedures, both with staff and in writing. And they also were looking to provide good training overview, materials, and processes for their subgrantees. That focus on subgrantees is a real theme that we're going to see here. We also asked them if they developed any specific internal tools, processes, or policies to help them manage the NSCHC process. They said that they use an internal tracking spreadsheet, and they even do an audit of that every 6 months. They've also gone ahead and shared that tracking sheet with their subgrantees, again, to help them manage compliance. Finally, we asked if they had any other advice, and they had some interesting thoughts. They said it was helpful to have the NSCHCs live with one person at the intermediary. We would add to that a backup's probably a good idea too, but they really like the centralization, and that's a theme we've heard from some other of our grantees. They also pointed out the usefulness of our frequently asked questions document, and I'll show you where you can find that in just a minute. They also recommended connecting with past intermediaries to get their tools. And finally, they said that you should ensure that documents are secure because they do contain a lot of sensitive information. Finally, we want to point out some common errors that we see in the NSCHC process. Be sure to review the right modules in the e-course or our video training library to learn more about each of these. The first error that we want to talk about are late searches of the National Sex Offender Public Website, or NSOPW. By far, this is the most frequent compliance issue that we see. You may remember from our e-course that the NSOPW is the only component required for every individual in a covered position without exception. You may also remember that it must be complete before an individual begins work on a SIF grant. This means that at a minimum, an NSOPW must be complete for every individual on your SIF grant before you can begin charging their time to that SIF grant. And that applies to both individuals funded by the federal share and the match, because of course we know they're both in covered positions. This is the most frequent issue that we see, even though the NSOPW is a free instant online search. If you do nothing else, ensure that you complete an NSOPW on time for every individual in a covered position. We also often see incomplete searches of the NSOPW. Again, you can view our e-course or our video training library for more information on this. What's important to note here is that the NSOPW sometimes requires a couple of extra steps. If you receive any results from your search, you need to make sure that those individuals are not your applicant. And if there are any states that are not reporting at that time, you need to fill that information gap. If you're not quite sure what those terms mean, it's a good indication that you should go back and review that module in the e-course or the relevant video in our video training library. The key point here is to remember that an NSOPW search might not be done just when you hit that big red search button. Finally, we find that organizations that work with vendors and human resource departments often are subject to non-compliance. These organizations are very used to doing things a certain way, and that way is rarely compliant with the NSCHC requirements. If you are working with a vendor or a human resource department in your organization, it is essential to document their compliance because your organization will be responsible if you are not compliant, and that means you could be subject to cost disallowance. We have tools available on the Knowledge Network to help you do that, and our e-course is also a great tool to start the conversation. Make sure that they understand what our requirements are, and make sure that you document exactly how they comply if you intend to use either a for-profit vendor or a human resource department in this process. We've got lots of resources available to help you, and they all live at that link right on the screen right now, the NSCHC Knowledge Network. It includes that online e-course I've been talking about an awful lot in the course of this video, and the video training library. Those are a series of 10 short, generally 3 to 5 minute videos about specific pieces of the NSCHC process that you can use as a refresher and that you can share with your sub-grantees. It includes the vendor compliance tool and some great checklists. It also includes those frequently asked questions that I alluded to earlier. With these tools and resources and some preparation, you can be on time every time with these very important requirements. Thanks for your commitment to protecting vulnerable populations, and thanks for your commitment to being a sound steward of federal dollars as well. We're very excited about your new relationship with the Social Innovation Fund and the Corporation for National Community Service, and we don't want compliance issues to get in the way of achieving your intended impact. So good luck, and please get in touch with CNCS if you have any questions. Thank you again.